Some folks say losing everything teaches you what really matters. Cole Barlow learned that lesson 15 winters ago when his wife died and left him with nothing but memories and an old mule named Smoke. He'd been wandering the desert ever since, looking for a place that felt like home. When he found the abandoned silver camp at Sagebrush Hollow, the broken buildings seemed to whisper his name. Behind the old mine office, Cole discovered a hidden chamber filled with journals, photographs, and a small, dusty cradle. The pages told the story of a family trapped by a cave-in decades ago. As Cole read their final words, he realized this place held the same kind of heartbreak he'd been carrying. But what secret had this family been protecting that someone wanted buried forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cole Barlow's fingers found the worn gold band in his coat pocket, same as they had every morning for the past 15 years. Sarah's wedding ring had grown smooth under his touch, the delicate engraving nearly worn away by countless moments when grief demanded something tangible to hold on to. The metal caught the first rays of dawn filtering through the cracked window of what used to be the mine office at Sagebrush Hollow, and for just a moment it gleamed like it had on their wedding day. He'd been a different man then. 28 years old with calloused hands from working his own small farm outside Millerville, a town that existed now only in his memory and on faded maps that railroad companies kept in dusty file cabinets. Sarah had been the schoolteacher's daughter, pretty as spring rain and twice as refreshing to a man who spent his days wrestling with stubborn soil and ornery cattle. She'd worn this ring for 12 good years before the consumption took her, and Cole had carried it for 15 more. Morning his wife died, Cole had sat beside her bed and watched the sunrise paint their bedroom wall the same pale gold as her hair. She'd squeezed his hand with what little strength remained and whispered, "Don't you go carrying my ghost around forever, Cole Barlow. Promise me you'll find something worth living for." He'd promised, of course, because you promise a dying woman anything she asks. But promises made in grief aren't always promises a man can keep. 3 months after Sarah's funeral, the railroad came through with their government papers and their surveyor's chains, measuring out a path for the great iron horse that would connect the eastern territories to the California coast. They offered Cole $60 for his 140 acres of prime farmland, enough to start over somewhere else, they said, enough to build a new life. What they didn't say was that $60 wouldn't buy a new life for a man whose heart had been buried with his wife. Cole had taken their money because he had no choice. Loaded what he could carry into a wagon pulled by Smoke, a stubborn mule he'd bought from a traveling preacher who swore the animal was blessed with uncommon sense, and headed west into the high desert country where a man could disappear if he had a mind to. Smoke stood now in what had once been the livery stable of Sagebrush Hollow, methodically working his way through a pile of wild grass Cole had gathered the previous evening. The mule's grey coat had grown shaggy with the approaching winter, and his dark eyes held the patient wisdom of an animal who'd learned that home wasn't a place, but a state of mind shared between a man and his beast. "Morning, old friend," Cole said, running his hand along Smoke's neck. The mule's ears flicked forward in greeting, but he didn't pause in his breakfast. 15 years of wandering had taught them both the value of routine, the comfort found in small rituals that made each day feel less like survival and more like living. The abandoned mining camp stretched out before them in the early light, a collection of weathered buildings that time and wind had carved into something between ruins and sculpture. The main street ran straight as a rifle shot from the mine entrance to the camp's edge, lined with structures that had once housed the hopes and dreams of families chasing silver veins through the mountain's heart. Now the buildings leaned against each other like old men sharing secrets, their windows dark and their doors hanging open to reveal empty rooms where ghosts might dance. Cole had stumbled into Sagebrush Hollow 3 days ago, following a game trail that wound through the juniper and sage toward what he'd hoped might be water. The camp sat in a natural bowl between two ridges, sheltered from the worst of the desert wind, but open enough to catch the morning sun. A thin stream trickled down from the mountains, pooling in a catch basin someone had dug behind the assay office, before continuing on its journey toward the valley floor. It was the kind of place that called to a man who'd grown tired of wandering, the kind of place where a person might stop running from his ghosts and start learning to live with them instead. The hidden chamber beneath the mine office had revealed itself by accident. Cole had been looking for a place to stable smoke when he'd noticed the way one section of floorboards sat differently from the rest. A few minutes with his pry bar had revealed a trapdoor leading to a narrow tunnel that opened into what must have been someone's private refuge. A room carved from living rock and fitted with shelves, a small table, and a wooden chair that still held the impression of its last occupant. But it was the personal belongings that had stopped Cole's breath in his chest. The journals filled with careful handwriting, the photographs of a young family posed stiffly for the camera, and in the corner a baby's cradle carved from pine and polished smooth by loving hands. Someone had lived here, loved here, and died here, leaving behind only the artifacts of interrupted dreams. The topmost journal belonged to someone named Thomas Hendricks, and his words painted a picture of a man not unlike Cole himself, someone who'd come west seeking a fresh start and found instead a place that felt like destiny. Thomas had written about his wife Mary, about their plans for the future, about the silver vein he'd discovered that would secure their family's fortune. But the entries grew shorter as they progressed, filled with worry about strange sounds in the mine and men who asked too many questions about his findings. The final entry, dated September 23rd, 1887, reads simply, "The tunnel collapsed today. Mary and little Emma are trapped below. I can hear them crying through the rock. Going to try the eastern passage. If anyone finds this, tell them we loved each other to the end." Cole had read those words 3 times before the weight of their meaning settled into his bones. This wasn't just an abandoned mining camp, it was a tomb, a place where love had been buried alive beneath tons of stone and decades of silence. And somehow, inexplicably, he'd been led here to bear witness to their story. The practical part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through 15 years of hard wandering, whispered that he should move on. Winter was coming to the high desert, and a sensible man would find shelter closer to civilization, somewhere with supplies and other folks to help if trouble came calling. But the deeper part of his heart, the part that still ached for Sarah's laugh and the children they'd never had, recognized something in this place that felt like coming home. Cole walked to the window and looked out at the mountains, rising like cathedral spires against the morning sky. Somewhere beneath his feet lay the remains of a family whose love had been strong enough to face death together. Their story deserved better than silence, and maybe, just maybe, telling it would help him find the peace that had eluded him since Sarah died. He pulled her ring from his pocket one more time, letting the gold catch the light before slipping it back into the safety of his coat. Today he would explore more of the camp, read more of Thomas's journals, and begin to understand what had really happened in this place where hope and tragedy walked hand in hand. Outside, smoke nickered softly, a sound that might have been agreement or simple contentment. Either way, it was enough to convince Cole that staying was the right choice. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't running toward something or away from something, he was simply present in a place that needed him as much as he needed it. The sun climbed higher over Sagebrush Hollow, painting the broken buildings with warm light and long shadows that seemed to dance with memories. And in the hidden chamber beneath the mine office, the dead artifacts of the Hendricks family waited patiently for someone to give their story the ending it deserved. The sepia-toned photograph stared back at Cole from the wooden table in the hidden chamber, its surface cracked with age, but still clear enough to capture the hope in 3 pairs of eyes. Thomas Hendricks stood tall and proud behind his seated wife, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Mary held their baby daughter against her chest, the infant's tiny fist curled around what looked like a silver rattle. Someone had written, "The Hendricks family, spring 1887" in careful script along the bottom edge. Cole held the photograph closer to the oil lamp he'd managed to coax back to life, studying the faces of people who'd been dead for decades, but somehow felt more real to him than most of the living folks he'd encountered in recent years. Thomas had the weathered look of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands, but his eyes held the bright intelligence of someone who saw possibilities where others saw only rock and dirt. Mary appeared younger, maybe 22 or 23, with dark hair pinned back in the fashion of the day and a smile that suggested she found joy in simple things. But it was baby Emma who captured Cole's attention most completely. The child couldn't have been more than 6 months old, yet something in her expression, alertness, a curiosity about the world beyond the camera's lens, reminded him painfully of the children he and Sarah had dreamed of having. The children who'd never drawn breath, who lived now only in the realm of might-have-beens that haunted quiet moments. He set the photograph carefully back on the table and reached for Thomas's journal, the leather binding, soft with age and handling. The early entries painted a picture of a man filled with optimism about his prospects in the silver fields of Nevada Territory. Thomas wrote about staking his claim, about the promising ore samples he'd found, about his plans to send for Mary and the baby once he'd established himself properly. June 15th, 1887, Cole read aloud, his voice echoing softly in the stone chamber. Mary and Emma arrived on the afternoon stage. The camp is rough, but Mary sees the potential in everything. She's already talking about planting a garden behind the house and teaching Emma to read from the same books her mother used back in Ohio. The baby is growing strong and curious about everything. Yesterday she reached for a butterfly and nearly tumbled from Mary's arms trying to catch it. The entries continued in this vein for several weeks, documenting the small victories and challenges of frontier life. Thomas described finding a particularly rich vein of silver ore, his excitement barely contained in the careful penmanship. Mary's presence in the journals grew stronger as Thomas began recording her observations and dreams alongside his own mining reports. Then the tone began to shift. August 3rd, 1887, a man came by today asking questions about my claim. Said he represented some Eastern interests looking to purchase mineral rights in the territory. Told him I wasn't interested in selling, but he seemed to know more about my findings than I'm comfortable with. Mary thinks I worry too much, but something about the fellow didn't sit right. August 19th, 1887, more strangers in camp. They claim to be surveyors for the railroad company, but surveyors don't usually carry the kind of hardware these men pack. Found boot prints near the mine entrance this morning that weren't there yesterday. Mary keeps Emma close to the house now, won't let her play outside unless I'm nearby. Cole felt a familiar chill settle between his shoulder blades, the same sensation he'd learned to trust during his wandering years when trouble was brewing just beyond the horizon. He'd seen enough of the world to recognize the pattern Thomas was describing, the subtle pressure that powerful interests brought to bear when they wanted something from someone who wasn't inclined to sell. September 10th, 1887. The mine shaft collapsed during the night. Strange thing is, I'd checked the support timbers just yesterday, and they were solid as bedrock. Mary heard the rumbling and thought it might be thunder, but the sky was clear. Found dynamite residue near the entrance this morning. Someone wanted to shut down my operation, but they don't know about the Eastern Passage I've been working. The silver vein runs deeper than anyone imagines. The handwriting grew more hurried as the entries progressed, Thomas's careful script giving way to the urgent scrawl of a man who understood his time was running short. September 20th, 1887. They came in broad daylight this time. 3 men with badges claiming to represent the Territorial Mining Authority said there'd been complaints about unsafe practices, that the mine needed to be inspected before operations could continue. I know a shakedown when I see one. Told Mary to pack our things and be ready to leave at first light. But where can a man run when the law itself is crooked? September 22nd, 1887. They're not waiting for legal proceedings anymore. Found 2 more men watching the camp from the ridge this morning. Mary is frightened, and Emma can sense her mother's fear. The baby cries more than usual, won't settle even when Mary sings to her. I've moved most of our important papers and photographs down here to the chamber. If something happens to us, maybe someone will find them someday and know we didn't just disappear. The final entry, the one Cole had read the day before, still made his chest tight with recognition of a man's desperate love for his family. As Cole closed the journal, something small and metallic caught his eye near the back corner of the chamber. He lifted the lamp and discovered what looked like a surveyor's tool, a compass set in a brass housing with initials engraved on the back, J.M. Beside it lay a leather portfolio containing detailed maps of the mining district, marked with notations in different handwriting than Thomas's careful script. The maps showed not just the existing claims, but proposed routes for railroad construction that would cut directly through the heart of the silver fields. Someone had been planning a major development project, the kind that would require removing any inconvenient obstacles like families with legitimate mining claims who refused to sell. Cole studied the compass more closely and noticed something odd about its behavior. Instead of pointing north, the needle swung steadily toward the mine entrance, as if magnetized by something deeper in the mountain. He'd heard stories of lodestones and magnetic ore deposits that could affect navigation instruments, but this felt different, purposeful, almost like a sign pointing toward secrets that hadn't yet been revealed. A sound from above made him freeze, footsteps, deliberate and measured, crossing the floor of the mine office. Cole extinguished the lamp and listened in the sudden darkness, every sense straining to identify the source of the disturbance. It could have been smoke moving around in the stable, but the rhythm was wrong. Too steady, too human. The footsteps paused directly overhead, and Cole heard the scrape of something heavy being moved across the wooden floor. Someone was up there, someone who knew about the hidden chamber and was trying to find the entrance. Cole's hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt, a habit formed by 15 years of sleeping rough in country, where a man's survival often depended on how quickly he could respond to threats. But as his fingers closed around the worn handle, he thought about Thomas Hendricks facing a similar moment, a man with a family to protect, surrounded by forces too powerful to fight with simple weapons. The difference was that Cole had no one depending on him anymore. If trouble had found him in this place of old sorrows, he could face it without worrying about collateral damage. The thought brought a strange kind of peace, the freedom that comes from having nothing left to lose except the truth. Above him, the footsteps resumed their methodical search. Cole remained perfectly still in the darkness, clutching the compass that pointed toward mysteries yet to be revealed. Surrounded by the artifacts of a family whose story had waited nearly 40 years for someone to finish telling it. Whatever came next, he was ready. The footsteps faded into the distance, but Cole remained motionless in the darkness for another 20 minutes, counting his heartbeats and listening to the silence settle back over the hidden chamber. When he finally risked lighting the lamp again, his hands trembled only slightly, a marked improvement from the days when sudden noises could send him diving for cover behind the nearest rock or tree. The leather-bound mining journal lay open where he'd left it. But now, Cole noticed something he'd missed in his earlier reading. Tucked between the back pages was a folded sheet of paper covered with Thomas's careful drawings, not the rough sketches of a man marking ore deposits, but detailed diagrams that looked more like engineering plans than mining notes. Cole spread the paper flat on the wooden table, weighing down the corners with small stones he'd found scattered around the chamber. The drawings showed cross-sections of the mine tunnels, but also something else, a complex system of chambers and passages that extended far deeper into the mountain than any normal silver operation would require. Thomas had drawn arrows indicating airflow, marked water sources, and noted structural details that suggested someone had spent considerable time planning an underground refuge. At the bottom of the page, in Thomas's increasingly urgent handwriting, were notes that made Cole's skin crawl. Eastern Passage connects to natural caverns, could house 20 families if needed. Springs provide fresh water year-round. Multiple escape routes to valley floor. God willing, we'll never need this knowledge, but a man must prepare for the worst. The implications hit Cole like a physical blow. Thomas Hendricks hadn't just been mining silver, he'd been preparing a sanctuary, a place where families could hide if the territorial conflicts he'd sensed brewing finally erupted into open violence. The man had seen trouble coming from multiple directions and had tried to build something that could protect the people he cared about. Cole turned to a section of the journal he hadn't yet explored, pages filled with technical observations about ore quality and geological formations. But scattered throughout the mining data were symbols that didn't belong in any engineering manual, strange markings that looked almost like a code, accompanied by numbers that might have been measurements or coordinates. One symbol appeared repeatedly, a circle, bisected by 3 wavy lines, drawn with the kind of precision that suggested it held specific meaning. Beside it, Thomas had written cryptic notes like J.M. confirms the old stories, and deeper than silver, older than territory claims. Whatever Thomas had found in the mountain, it had been significant enough to document in code, significant enough to hide from the men who were watching his every move. Cole heard smoke whicker softly from the stable above, the mule's voice carrying a note of unease that made Cole close the journal and gather the scattered papers. If someone had been prowling around the camp, Smoke would have sensed their presence long before Cole heard the footsteps. The mule's instincts had kept them both alive through situations where human senses would have failed them completely. He climbed back through the tunnel and emerged into the mine office, noting that someone had indeed moved things around during their search. Books that had been stacked on the windowsill were now scattered across the floor, and the old filing cabinet had been pulled away from the wall, as if someone had been looking for hidden compartments. Outside, the afternoon sun painted the camp buildings with golden light that should have felt welcoming, but instead seemed to emphasize how exposed and vulnerable the little settlement was. Anyone approaching from the ridge could observe the entire camp without being seen, could count the smoke from cooking fires, and track the movements of anyone foolish enough to think they were alone in the wilderness. Cole made his way to the stable, where Smoke stood with his ears pricked forward and his attention focused on something beyond the camp's eastern boundary. The mule's dark eyes held the alert wariness of an animal that knew predators were nearby, even if they remained hidden for the moment. "What is it, old friend?" Cole asked, running his hand along Smoke's neck. "What's got you so worked up?" As if in answer, the distant sound drifted across the desert air, the rhythmic clatter of horseshoes on stone that meant riders were approaching from the direction of the main trail. Not the casual pace of travelers looking for water or shelter, but the purposeful advance of men with business to conduct. Cole led Smoke deeper into the stable and positioned himself where he could observe the camp's main street without being seen. The riders appeared a few minutes later. 3 men on horseback, well-armed and moving with the kind of coordination that suggested military or law enforcement background. They wore civilian clothes, but something in their bearing marked them as professionals, the type of men who got paid to solve problems that couldn't be handled through normal legal channels. The lead rider was a tall, lean man with graying hair and eyes that missed nothing as they swept the camp from end to end. He sat his horse like someone accustomed to command, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who expected immediate obedience. "Barlow," he called out. "Cole Barlow, we know you're here. We're not looking for trouble, but we need to have a conversation." Cole's blood chilled. These men knew his name, which meant they'd been tracking him specifically, rather than simply investigating the camp. In 15 years of wandering, he'd made it a point to avoid leaving traces that could be followed. Yet somehow, these strangers had found him in one of the most isolated places he'd ever sheltered. "We represent certain interests that have a legitimate claim to this property," the leader continued. "You're trespassing on private land, Mr. Barlow, but we're prepared to be reasonable about the situation. Come out, and we can discuss this like civilized men." Cole remained hidden, his mind racing through possibilities and options. The men showed no signs of preparing to search the buildings, which suggested they were either supremely confident or operating under constraints that limited their methods. Either way, their presence here meant that Thomas Hendrick's story wasn't as buried in the past as Cole had assumed. The leader waited another few minutes before signaling to his companions. "We'll be back tomorrow, Mr. Barlow. I suggest you use the time to consider your position. This place has a history of being unhealthy for folks who don't understand when they're not wanted." The three riders wheeled their horses and headed back toward the main trail, but Cole noticed that one of them remained on the ridge, overlooking the camp, a sentinel positioned to watch for movement and report on Cole's activities. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Cole realized that his peaceful refuge had become something much more dangerous. A place where past and present conspiracies intersected, where men were still willing to kill to protect secrets that should have been buried with the people who discovered them. Thomas Hendrick's journal felt heavier in his hands as he considered what the coded symbols might mean, what truths were worth dying for, and whether he had the courage to seek answers that powerful people were determined to keep hidden. That evening, as Cole prepared a simple meal over a small fire behind the assay office, he discovered Mary Hendrick's recipe box tucked beneath a loose floorboard near what had once been the kitchen area. The wooden container was no larger than a cigar box, but it opened to reveal a carefully organized collection of handwritten cards, dried herbs, still fragrant after decades, and pressed flowers that crumbled at his touch, but retained hints of their original colors. The recipes themselves told the story of a woman making the best of frontier conditions while dreaming of better days ahead. Emma's teething biscuits, written in Mary's careful script, called for ingredients that would have been precious commodities in a remote mining camp. Thomas's favorite cornbread included a note in the margin. He says it reminds him of his mother's cooking back in Kentucky. Each card represented not just a meal, but a moment of domestic hope in a place where hope was often in short supply. But it was the pressed flowers that affected Cole most deeply. Mountain lupine, Indian paintbrush, and desert primrose wildflowers that still bloomed in the meadows above the camp each spring. Mary had taken the time to preserve beauty in a place where most people saw only rock and hardship, creating small reminders that life could flourish even in the harshest conditions. Cole found himself thinking about Sarah as he examined Mary's treasures. His wife had kept a similar collection, pressed flowers from their farm tucked between the pages of her Bible, recipe cards written in her flowing hand that had made their simple cabin feel like a palace. The two women were separated by decades and hundreds of miles, but their love for the small rituals that made a house into a home transcended time and distance. As darkness settled over the camp, Cole made his way carefully to what had once been Mary's garden plot behind the main house. The irrigation channels Thomas had dug were still visible, though choked with weeds and desert grass. But in the protected corner where Mary had planted her herbs, Cole discovered something remarkable. A small patch of mint that had somehow survived the decades, spreading slowly but steadily from its original location. The mint's presence struck him as almost miraculous, a living connection to the woman who'd planted it with her own hands. Cole knelt beside the patch and breathed in the sharp, clean scent, imagining Mary working this same soil while baby Emma played nearby in the shade of a canvas awning. The scene felt so real he could almost hear the child's laughter carried on the evening breeze. He began clearing away the weeds and dead growth, working by moonlight to restore the garden's boundaries. It was careful, meditative work that reminded him of evenings spent helping Sarah tend their own vegetable plot, As his hands moved through the familiar motions of cultivation, Cole felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival. The mint patch was more than just an abandoned garden. It was proof that love could endure even when the lovers themselves were gone. Mary had planted these herbs to flavor meals for her family, to brew teas that would soothe Emma's teething pain, to create small comforts in a landscape that offered few. Her care had outlasted her life, had survived cave-ins and winter storms and decades of neglect to emerge each spring as a testament to the persistence of hope. Cole spent the next several hours working in the garden, guided by the layout Mary had established and the practical knowledge he'd gained from his own farming years. He found remnants of what might have been sage and thyme, carefully separated them from the encroaching weeds, and created small channels to direct water from the spring that still trickled down from the mountains. As he worked, Cole began talking to Mary as if she were beside him in the garden, sharing observations about the soil conditions and asking her opinion about where to plant the wild herbs he'd gathered during his wanderings. The conversation felt natural, comfortable, the way he'd once talked to Sarah during their evening chores, sharing the small thoughts and worries that make up a life lived in partnership. "Your Thomas was a good man," he said quietly, patting soil around a struggling sage plant. "You can see it in his writing, the way he worried about keeping you and Emma safe. A lot of men in his position would have taken that railroad money and run, but he wanted to build something lasting for his family." The night air carried the scent of the restored herbs, mixing with the smell of wood smoke from his banked fire and the clean mountain breeze that flowed down from the peaks. For the first time since arriving at Sagebrush Hollow, Cole felt the presence of peace, not the restless peace of movement and distraction, but the deep contentment that comes from being in the right place at the right time. When he finally returned to his shelter in the mine office, Cole found himself looking at the hidden chamber with new eyes. This wasn't just a repository of artifacts and memories. It was a sacred space where love had made its final stand against forces that valued profit over human dignity. Thomas and Mary Hendricks had faced their end together in this place, surrounded by the possessions that represented their dreams for the future. Cole pulled Mary's recipe box closer to the oil lamp and selected one of the cards at random. "Sunday apple cake, for special occasions when we want to remember that life is sweet despite its troubles." The recipe called for cinnamon and nutmeg, ingredients that would have been costly and difficult to obtain in a frontier mining camp. But Mary had included them anyway, believing that some pleasures were worth the expense, that celebrations mattered even in difficult times. As Cole prepared for sleep, he found himself making plans for the following day. He would continue restoring Mary's garden, would explore more of Thomas's coded notes, and would begin preparing for the confrontation he knew was coming. The men who'd visited today represented forces that had killed the Hendricks family and would certainly kill again to protect their secrets. But tonight, surrounded by the artifacts of a love that had endured beyond death, Cole felt ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. He was no longer just a wandering man seeking shelter. He was the guardian of a story that deserved to be told, the keeper of truths that powerful men had tried to bury beneath decades of silence and fear. The silver locket was so small that Cole almost missed it, nestled in the folds of a tiny blanket at the bottom of Emma's cradle. The delicate chain had tarnished to black, but when he carefully opened the heart-shaped pendant, the contents inside remained pristine. A single lock of baby-fine hair, the color of wheat, and a miniature silver cross, no bigger than his thumbnail. Cole's hands trembled as he held the locket up to the lamplight. The hair was so soft it seemed to float in the still air of the chamber, and the cross bore an inscription so small he had to squint to read it. Emma Rose Hendricks, born the 15th of March, 1887, beloved of God and family. Someone, probably Mary, had commissioned this piece from a skilled craftsman, had spent precious money to create a keepsake that would preserve the memory of their daughter's early months. The discovery hit Cole harder than all the journals and photographs combined, because this wasn't just evidence of the Hendricks family's existence, it was proof of their dreams for the future. Parents didn't create such intimate mementos unless they believed their child would grow up to treasure them, would someday show them to children of their own, while telling stories about grandparents who'd loved her before she was old enough to remember. Cole closed the locket and held it against his chest, feeling the weight of all the futures that had been stolen from this family. Emma would never grow up to wear this locket on her wedding day, would never pass it down to daughters who carried her mother's eyes and her father's determination. The chain of love and memory that should have stretched across generations had been severed before it could begin, leaving only these precious artifacts as witnesses to what might have been. The emotional impact was complicated by memories Cole had tried to keep buried for 15 years. He and Sarah had lost 2 babies before they were born, tiny souls who'd never drawn breath but had already claimed space in their parents' hearts. Sarah had kept a wooden box filled with the baby clothes she'd sewn by lamplight, tiny gowns and caps that would never be worn. After she died, Cole had buried that box beneath the oak tree behind their house, unable to carry those particular ghosts into his wandering years. Now, holding Emma's locket, he wondered if he'd made a mistake in leaving those memories behind. Maybe grief shared its burden more gracefully than grief carried alone. Maybe the artifacts of interrupted love deserved preservation rather than burial, needed witnesses who understood the weight of dreams deferred. Cole began exploring the rest of Emma's possessions with the careful attention of a man handling sacred relics. The cradle itself was a masterpiece of frontier craftsmanship, carved from pine and sanded to silk smoothness. Thomas had spent hours shaping the curved rockers, had carved a pattern of mountain flowers along the headboard that matched the pressed blooms in Mary's recipe box. Every detail spoke of a father's love, of long winter evenings spent preparing for his daughter's arrival. Inside the cradle, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from moisture and time, Cole found a collection of items that painted a vivid picture of Emma's brief life. A set of wooden blocks carved with letters and numbers, a soft doll made from scraps of Mary's dresses, and a small silver rattle that matched the one Emma held in the family photograph. Each toy had been chosen with care, designed to stimulate a growing mind while providing comfort during the inevitable tears and frustrations of childhood. But it was the baby's clothes that nearly broke Cole's composure completely. Mary had sewn each piece by hand, had embroidered tiny flowers and birds on the collars and cuffs, had hemmed the edges with stitches so small and perfect they seemed impossible to achieve by candlelight. The care invested in every garment spoke of a mother's fierce love, of countless hours spent preparing for a future that would never arrive. Cole found himself wondering about Emma's personality, about the woman she might have become if fate had been kinder. Had she inherited her father's analytical mind or her mother's obvious artistic gifts? Would she have been drawn to books like Mary or to the outdoor pursuits that had attracted Thomas to mining? The questions were impossible to answer, but asking them felt like a form of prayer, a way of honoring a life that had been cut short before its potential could be realized. As he carefully rewrapped the clothes and returned them to the cradle, Cole noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of Emma's tiny dresses bore dark stains that he'd initially mistaken for rust or water damage. But as he examined the fabric more closely under the lamplight, he realized the stains were the wrong color, the wrong consistency. These weren't the marks of time and neglect, they were bloodstains, still faintly visible after nearly 40 years. The implications hit him like a physical blow. Emma hadn't died, peacefully in the cave-in, crushed quickly by falling stone. She'd been injured, had bled, while her parents desperately tried to save her life. The final hours of the Hendricks family had been even more horrific than Thomas's journal entries suggested, filled with a child's pain and her parents' helpless anguish. Cole set the stained dress aside and forced himself to continue his examination of the cradle's contents, driven by a growing need to understand exactly what had happened in this place of buried sorrows. He found Mary's sewing kit, still organized with the precision of a woman who took pride in her domestic skills. Needles arranged by size, thread wound on wooden spools, and a small pair of scissors that had been kept sharp enough to cut silk. But among the ordinary sewing supplies was something unexpected, a letter opener shaped like a miniature sword, its blade still keen after decades in storage. The handle was engraved with initials that didn't belong to the Hendricks. Family, J.M., the same initials Cole had found on the surveyor's compass. Someone else had been in this chamber, had left behind tools and artifacts that connected him to whatever conspiracy had destroyed this family. As Cole studied the letter opener, he heard something that made his skin crawl. The distant sound of a baby crying carried on the night air like an echo from the past. He knew it was impossible, knew that grief and isolation could play tricks on a man's mind, but the sound was so real, so heartbreaking, that he found himself moving toward the tunnel entrance as if he could somehow answer that long-ago call for comfort. The crying faded as quickly as it had begun, leaving Cole alone with the artifacts of interrupted love and the growing certainty that the Hendricks family's story was far from over. The surveyor's compass had been calling to Cole all morning, its needle still stubbornly pointing toward the mine entrance rather than magnetic north, when he finally gave in to curiosity and followed its direction. The ancient brass instrument led him through a maze of collapsed tunnels to a section of the mine he hadn't yet explored, a natural cavern that opened like a cathedral beneath the mountain. The compass belonged to James Morrison, according to the initials engraved on its case, and Morrison's leather satchel lay exactly where the needle pointed, wedged between two fallen stones near what appeared to be an underground spring. The satchel had been protected from moisture by its position, and when Cole opened it, he found a collection of documents that changed everything he thought he knew about the conspiracy that had destroyed the Hendricks family. Morrison hadn't been working for the railroad company, as Cole had assumed. The surveyor's credentials identified him as an agent of the United States Geological Survey, sent to investigate reports of unusual mineral deposits in the Nevada Territory. But his personal notes revealed a man caught between his duty to the government and his growing realization that powerful private interests were manipulating federal policy for their own gain. The 10th of June, 1887, Morrison had written in a careful, educated hand. Initial surveys confirmed the presence of silver deposits as reported, but also something far more significant. The geological formations in this region suggest substantial copper reserves, possibly the largest undiscovered deposit in the Western Territories. If my calculations are correct, the mineral wealth here could rival the Comstock lode. But certain railroad interests appear to have advanced knowledge of these findings and are using intimidation tactics to acquire claims at far below their true value. Cole spread Morrison's maps across the cavern floor, weighing them down with stones from the spring's edge. The surveyor had documented not just the silver veins that Thomas had been mining, but a vast network of mineral deposits that extended for miles through the mountain range. Red ink marked copper deposits, blue indicated silver, and yellow showed what Morrison had labeled as unknown mineral formations requiring further study. But it was the black marks on Morrison's maps that made Cole's pulse quicken. These indicated areas where Morrison had found evidence of previous mining activity, not the crude excavations of individual prospectors, but systematic extraction operations that suggested organized, well-funded efforts. Someone had been working these mountains long before the official territory surveys had known about the mineral wealth and had been quietly claiming the best sites through shell companies and fraudulent documentation. The 15th of August, 1887, Morrison's journal continued, have documented evidence of at least 12 fraudulent mining claims filed through the Carson City office. The same shell companies appear on multiple claims, all connected to Eastern Railroad interests. Local miners like Hendricks are being systematically driven out through a combination of legal harassment and physical intimidation. Have written to Washington requesting investigation, but suspect my reports are being intercepted. Cole found the letters Morrison had mentioned, copies of correspondence sent to various government offices detailing the conspiracy he'd uncovered. The surveyor had been methodical in documenting his evidence, had prepared a comprehensive report that should have triggered federal intervention. But the letters were all stamped, "Returned, addressee unknown," suggesting that Morrison's superiors in Washington had either been compromised or had deliberately chosen to ignore his findings. The final entries in Morrison's journal painted a picture of a man who realized he'd discovered something too dangerous for his own safety. The 18th of September, 1887. My movements are being watched. Found evidence that my mail has been intercepted and my telegraph messages to Washington have been blocked at the local office. Thomas Hendricks reports similar harassment, but he refuses to abandon his claim. The man has a family to think about, but he also has more courage than sense. Have hidden copies of all documentation in the chamber beneath his mine office. If something happens to me, perhaps someone will find them someday and finish what I started. Cole felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air flowing through the cavern. Morrison had been planning to use the Hendricks family's hidden chamber as his document repository, which meant the surveyor had known about the secret room beneath the mine office. But if Morrison had hidden his evidence there, where was it now? Cole had searched the chamber thoroughly and found only the family's personal possessions. He examined the compass more carefully and noticed something he'd missed in his earlier inspection. The brass case opened not just to reveal the compass face, but also included a hidden compartment beneath the instrument itself. Inside, wrapped in oiled silk, were 3 small silver keys and a note in Morrison's handwriting. The deeper truth lies beyond the Eastern Passage. Th. showed me the way. But I fear we were both too late to save his family. The keys unlock what they died to protect. The Eastern Passage. Thomas had mentioned it in his journal, the route he'd planned to use to reach his trapped family after the main tunnel collapsed. Morrison's compass was pointing not just toward the mine entrance, but toward something deeper in the mountain, something that required 3 keys to access safely. Cole studied Morrison's maps with new understanding, tracing the surveyor's notations about underground water sources and natural ventilation systems. The man had been documenting not just mineral deposits, but the infrastructure necessary to support long-term underground operations. Thomas hadn't been preparing a simple refuge for his family. He'd been creating something much more ambitious, a hidden complex that could serve as both sanctuary and storage facility for evidence that powerful men would kill to suppress. As Cole prepared to leave the cavern, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh boot prints in the soft earth near the spring, prints that definitely hadn't been made by Thomas Hendricks or James Morrison decades ago. Someone else had been here recently, someone who knew about Morrison's hidden cache and had been searching for the same evidence that Cole was now carrying. The compass needle swung steadily toward the Eastern Passage as Cole made his way back through the mine tunnels, but now its direction felt less like guidance and more like a warning. Whatever lay beyond those 3 locks was important enough to justify murder in 1887, and someone in 1902 was still willing to kill to keep it hidden. Cole fingered the 3 silver keys in his pocket and wondered if he had the courage to follow Morrison's compass to its final destination, knowing that each step deeper into the mountain brought him closer to the truth that had already cost so many lives. The claim deed was hidden in plain sight, folded inside Morrison's geological survey, maps like a bookmark marking a particularly important passage. When Cole unfolded the yellowed document, the official seals and signatures seemed to leap off the page with devastating clarity. Transfer of mineral rights for sections 15 to 22, Sagebrush Hollow Mining District to Central Pacific Railroad Company, effective the 20th of September, 1887, 3 days before the Hendricks family died. The deed bore Thomas Hendricks' signature, but something about the handwriting made Cole's skin crawl. He'd become familiar with Thomas's careful penmanship through hours of reading the man's journals, and this signature was wrong, too fluid in some places, too rigid in others. Someone had forged Thomas's name on a document that transferred ownership of the richest mineral claim in the territory to the very interests he'd been fighting against. But the most chilling detail was the witness signature. James Morrison, United States Geological Survey. The man Cole had assumed was fighting the conspiracy had actually been part of it, had used his government credentials to legitimize the fraudulent transfer that sealed the Hendricks family's fate. Cole's hands shook as he read the supporting documents attached to the deed, a sworn affidavit claiming that Thomas Hendricks had voluntarily sold his claim to pay gambling debts, and a doctor's statement asserting that the miner had become mentally unstable due to prolonged exposure to mining chemicals. The paperwork created a completely fabricated narrative that painted Thomas as an unreliable man who'd abandoned his family responsibilities, making his subsequent disappearance seem like the predictable behavior of a coward rather than the tragic end of a murder victim. The final document in Morrison's collection was a letter that made everything clear. Mr. Morrison, your cooperation in this matter has been noted and appreciated. The additional compensation discussed will be forwarded to your account in San Francisco upon completion of the territorial survey. We trust that your official report will reflect the geological realities as we have discussed them, rather than any fanciful theories about extensive mineral deposits that might encourage undesirable settlement in the region. H. Cromwell, Central Pacific Railroad Company. Cole sat back on his heels in the underground cavern, feeling the weight of betrayal settle over him like a physical presence. Morrison hadn't been a hero trying to expose corruption. He'd been a paid conspirator, using his government position to provide official cover for a massive land grab. The surveyor's careful documentation hadn't been evidence of wrongdoing, but rather a detailed inventory of stolen wealth that the railroad company could exploit for decades. The 3 silver keys in his pocket suddenly felt heavier, more ominous. If Morrison had been working for the railroad company, what did those keys unlock? What had Thomas Hendricks hidden that even his betrayer hadn't been able to find? Cole forced himself to examine Morrison's compass again, studying the way its needle pointed steadily toward the eastern passage. The instrument wasn't malfunctioning due to magnetic interference. It had been deliberately modified to point towards something specific, something that Morrison had needed to find, but hadn't been able to access before his own death. The realization hit Cole like a physical blow. Morrison had died in this cavern not as a victim of the conspiracy, but as a casualty of his own greed. The surveyor had tried to double-cross his railroad employers, had attempted to claim the ultimate prize for himself rather than turning it over to his corporate masters. The evidence of Morrison's betrayal was hidden somewhere beyond the Eastern Passage, protected by locks that required 3 keys to open. Cole gathered Morrison's papers and made his way deeper into the mine system, following passages that Thomas Hendricks had carved with desperate efficiency during his final days. The Eastern Passage was larger than the others, reinforced with timber supports that spoke of careful engineering rather than hasty excavation. Thomas had been preparing for a siege, had created multiple routes between his surface claim and whatever sanctuary lay hidden in the mountain's heart. The passage ended at a massive stone door carved directly from the living rock, its surface decorated with the same symbols Cole had seen in Thomas's coded journal entries. 3 keyholes were arranged in a triangle around a central design, the circle bisected by 3 wavy lines that had appeared throughout Thomas's notes. Above the locks, carved with painstaking precision, was an inscription that made Cole's breath catch in his throat. For Emma Rose, who will inherit truth when lies have crumbled to dust. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a vault designed to preserve evidence for future generations, a testament that would outlast the men who'd tried to bury it. Thomas Hendricks had known he was going to die, had spent his final days creating something that would eventually bring justice to his family, even if he couldn't live to see it. Cole inserted the first key into its lock, feeling the mechanism turn with well-oiled precision. The second key followed, then the third, each one releasing tumblers that had waited 15 years for the right person to find them. When the final lock opened, the stone door swung inward on counterbalanced hinges that moved without sound, revealing a chamber that took Cole's breath away. The room beyond was larger than the hidden chamber beneath the mine office, carved with the skill of a master craftsman and fitted with shelves that held dozens of metal document containers. But it wasn't the size of the space that stunned Cole, it was the artifacts that filled it. Not just papers and photographs, but physical evidence of the conspiracy that had destroyed the Hendricks family. Samples of ore from claims that officially didn't exist. Shipping records showing mineral wealth being transported under false manifests, and account books documenting payments made to corrupt territorial officials. At the center of the chamber stood a desk carved from a single piece of granite, and on that desk lay Thomas Hendricks's final message to the world, a comprehensive record of everything he'd discovered about the railroad conspiracy, complete with names, dates, and dollar amounts that would have sent dozens of powerful men to federal prison if the evidence had ever reached honest authorities. But the most devastating revelation was contained in a sealed envelope marked, "For the honest man who will finish what I started." Inside, Cole found a complete confession written by James Morrison, himself a document that revealed the surveyor's change of heart in his final days, his growing horror at what he'd helped set in motion, and his desperate attempt to preserve evidence that would eventually bring the conspiracy to light. Morrison had died trying to undo the damage he'd caused, had used his knowledge of the mountain's geology to help Thomas create this hidden vault where truth could survive, even if the truth-tellers perished. The surveyor's compass wasn't pointing toward treasure, it was pointing toward redemption, toward the evidence that would finally give the Hendricks family the justice they'd been denied for 15 years. Cole stood in that underground chamber, surrounded by the carefully preserved evidence of corruption and murder, and realized that his role in this story wasn't as a passive observer of past tragedies. He was the honest man Thomas Hendricks had written about, the person destiny had led to this place to finish what had been started in blood and betrayal decades ago. The conspiracy that had killed the Hendricks family was still active, still claiming victims, still corrupting the mechanisms of justice for private gain. But now Cole held the weapons necessary to fight back, not guns or explosives, but documents and testimony that could topple the entire corrupt edifice if they reached the right hands. As he began gathering the most crucial evidence, Cole heard something that made his blood freeze, the distant sound of voices echoing through the mine tunnels, getting closer with each passing moment. The men who'd visited the camp the day before had returned, and this time they weren't interested in negotiating. The Winchester rifle that Cole found propped against the granite desk in Thomas's vault was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of a father's final stand, a testament to the lengths a man would go to protect his family's honor, even in the face of certain death. The stock bore careful notches that recorded successful hunts, and someone had carved "For Emma's future" into the wooden butt in letters small enough to escape casual notice. Cole ran his hands along the rifle's barrel, checking the action and finding it remarkably well preserved despite 15 years in the mountain's depths. Thomas had maintained this weapon with the same careful attention he'd given to his mining equipment and his family's possessions, everything in perfect working order, ready for the day when justice might finally demand its due. The voices in the mine tunnels were getting closer, and Cole could distinguish at least 3 different speakers moving through the passages with the confidence of men who knew exactly where they were going. They weren't searching randomly, someone had given them detailed information about the mine's layout, possibly including knowledge of the hidden vault that Thomas had died to protect. Cole gathered the most critical documents from Thomas's evidence collection, focusing on papers that would be easy to transport but impossible to replace. Morrison's confession, the forged claim deed, the account books showing payments to corrupt officials. These were the weapons he needed to fight a war that had been raging for 15 years in the shadows of territorial politics. He also selected several ore samples that Morrison had catalogued as coming from claims that officially didn't exist. Physical proof that the railroad company had been systematically looting mineral wealth while filing false reports with the territorial government. Each chunk of silver-bearing quartz represented thousands of dollars in stolen resources, multiplied across dozens of fraudulent claims throughout the mountain range. As Cole prepared to leave the vault, he paused at Thomas's desk and read the miner's final letter one more time. To whoever finds this record, I have failed to protect my family, but I pray that you will succeed in protecting the truth. The men who killed us believe that power and wealth place them beyond the reach of justice, but they underestimate the persistence of honest hearts. Use what I have preserved here to ensure that Emma's death serves a purpose greater than their greed. The weight of responsibility settled on Cole's shoulders like a physical burden. He was no longer just a wandering man seeking shelter from his own grief. He was the executor of a dead man's will, the instrument through which Thomas Hendricks would finally strike back at the forces that had destroyed his family. The role terrified and energized him in equal measure. Cole secured the most important documents in an oiled leather pouch that had belonged to Morrison, then carefully closed and locked the vault behind him. The stone door sealed with the same silent precision it had shown when opening, leaving no visible trace that anyone had disturbed Thomas's carefully preserved evidence. If the approaching men knew about the vault's existence, they would have to work for access to its contents. The eastern passage offered several routes back toward the mine's main entrance, but Cole chose the path that would take him deepest into the mountain's natural cave system. Thomas's maps showed a network of interconnected caverns that eventually emerged on the far side of the ridge, providing an escape route that avoided the heavily watched areas around Sagebrush Hollow. As he made his way through the winding passages, Cole reflected on the transformation that had occurred within him over the past few days. The broken man who'd stumbled into this abandoned camp, seeking nothing more than shelter, had been replaced by someone with a clear purpose and the determination to see it through. Sarah's wedding ring still rested in his coat pocket, but now it felt less like a burden of unchanging grief and more like a talisman connecting him to the power of love that transcends death. The voices behind him grew fainter as Cole penetrated deeper into the cave system, but he could still hear the echoes of men calling to each other as they searched the mine tunnels with growing frustration. They knew he was here. Someone had been watching his movements and had reported his discovery of the hidden evidence. But knowing and finding were two different things in a mountain honeycomb, with passages that could hide a man for weeks if he knew how to navigate them properly. Cole emerged from the caves on the eastern slope of the mountain just as the sun reached its zenith, painting the desert landscape in harsh light that revealed every detail of the terrain for miles in every direction. Below him, the town of Millfield spread across the valley floor, a collection of buildings that had grown substantially since his wandering years began, now large enough to support a telegraph office, a newspaper, and most importantly, a federal marshal's office. The sight of that distant town filled Cole with something he hadn't felt in years: hope for justice that extended beyond personal vengeance. Thomas Hendricks had preserved evidence that could expose corruption reaching from local mining offices to the highest levels of territorial government, but that evidence was worthless unless it reached authorities who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Cole's task was to become the messenger who carried truth from the mountain's darkness into the clear light of public scrutiny. But first, he had to survive the next few hours. The men searching for him weren't going to give up easily. They represented interests that had already committed multiple murders to protect their secrets, and they wouldn't hesitate to add one more body to the count if it meant keeping Thomas's evidence buried. Cole studied the terrain between his position and Millfield, plotting a route that would keep him hidden from observers while allowing rapid movement toward his destination. The desert offered little cover during daylight hours, but the network of arroyos and rocky outcroppings could conceal a man who understood how to use shadows and elevation to his advantage. As he prepared to begin his journey, Cole heard the distant sound of gunfire from the direction of Sagebrush Hollow, 3 sharp reports, followed by shouting voices that carried clearly across the thin mountain air. The search had turned violent, which meant that someone had either found evidence of Cole's presence in the vault or had grown frustrated enough with the hunt to start shooting at shadows. Either way, the escalation confirmed what Cole had already suspected. The conspiracy that had killed the Hendricks family was still active, still ruthless, and still willing to use lethal force to protect its secrets. The men hunting him weren't just hired thugs. They were professional killers, working for an organization that had survived and prospered for 15 years by eliminating threats before they could become dangerous. Cole checked the Winchester's Action 1, the final time, and started down the mountainside, moving with the careful efficiency of a man who understood that his own survival was now secondary to the greater mission of ensuring that justice finally triumphed over corruption. The documents in his leather pouch represented more than evidence. They were the voices of the dead demanding to be heard. The testimony of victims who had waited 15 years for someone brave enough to carry their story into the light. Behind him, the gunfire from Sagebrush Hollow continued sporadically, punctuated by the sound of men calling to each other as they coordinated their search. But ahead of him lay the town of Millfield, and the possibility of finding authorities honest enough to act on the evidence that Thomas Hendricks had died to preserve. The final confrontation between past and present, between corruption and justice, between the power of wealth and the persistence of truth, was about to begin. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Cole Barlow knew exactly where he belonged in that fight. The company badge lay glinting in the afternoon sun, where one of the riders had dropped it during their hasty dismount at Sagebrush Hollow. Cole spotted it from his position behind a boulder outcropping, the brass shield catching light like a signal mirror as 3 armed men spread out to search the abandoned camp. The badge bore the logo of Western Mining Consolidated, a company that hadn't existed during Thomas Hendricks' time, but clearly represented the same interests that had killed his family 15 years ago. Cole had made it halfway to Millfield when he'd spotted the dust cloud rising from the direction of the camp and realized his pursuers had given up searching the mine tunnels in favor of a more direct approach. They'd brought reinforcements. He counted 6 men total, all carrying rifles and moving with the tactical precision of experienced manhunters. Someone had decided that subtle intimidation was no longer sufficient. They were prepared to end this threat permanently. The leader of the group was the same grey-haired man who'd called out Cole's name the previous day, but now his demeanor had shifted from reasonable negotiation to cold efficiency. He directed his men with hand signals, establishing a perimeter around the camp that would prevent anyone from escaping back into the mine system. They'd learned from their previous search and were taking no chances with hidden passages or underground refuges. "Barlow," the leader called out, his voice echoing across the empty buildings. "We know you're here somewhere. We found your mule, found your gear. There's nowhere left to run, and we're done playing games. You've got something that belongs to our employers, and we're authorized to use whatever force necessary to retrieve it." Cole's jaw tightened as he thought about Smoke, trapped in the camp's livery stable, probably confused and frightened by the strangers who'd invaded their temporary sanctuary. The mule had been his constant companion through 15 years of wandering, had shared hunger and cold, and the simple comfort of not being entirely alone in an indifferent world. If these men hurt Smoke to force him out of hiding, Cole would make them pay for that cruelty in ways they couldn't imagine. From his concealed position, Cole could see that the searchers were professional but not infallible. They'd made the classic mistake of assuming their quarry would behave predictably. hiding in buildings, seeking familiar shelter, responding to threats with panic rather than strategy. They hadn't considered that 15 years of survival in harsh country might have taught a man different lessons about when to run and when to stand his ground. Cole checked the Winchester's ammunition and counted the cartridges in his pocket. Thomas had left him well supplied for a fight, but 6-to-1 odds required more than superior firepower. They demanded tactical thinking, and the kind of desperate courage that came from having nothing left to lose except the truth. The company badge in the dirt below represented everything Cole had learned to hate about the forces that shaped territorial politics. Western Mining Consolidated was probably owned by the same railroad interests that had corrupted James Morrison and murdered the Hendricks family, just operating under a different name to avoid the legal complications that might arise if anyone ever investigated their historical crimes. The badge connected past and present conspiracies in an unbroken chain of greed and violence that had claimed innocent lives for decades. "Last chance, Barlow," the leader shouted. "We know you found Morrison's papers. We know you've been in the vault. Hand over what you took, and we might let you walk away from this. Keep playing games, and you'll end up like the family that used to live here, buried so deep nobody will ever find the pieces." The casual mention of the Hendricks family's fate confirmed what Cole had suspected about these men's connection to the original murders. They weren't just hired guns working for modern corporate interests. They were the inheritors of a criminal legacy, possibly even related to the men who'd triggered the mine collapse that killed Thomas, Mary, and baby Emma. The conspiracy had generational staying power, passing its methods and ruthlessness from one group of killers to the next. Cole studied the tactical situation with the calculating eye of a man who'd learned to think several moves ahead during his wandering years. The searchers had positioned themselves to control the obvious escape routes, but they'd underestimated the complexity of the terrain surrounding Sagebrush Hollow. The mountains offered dozens of positions where a single rifleman could control access to the camp, and Cole knew these ridges better than men who'd arrived with maps and assumptions. The moment of decision had arrived. Cole could try to slip away undetected, could carry Thomas's evidence to Millfield through backcountry routes that would take days to traverse. Or he could stand and fight here, in the place where the Hendricks family had made their final stand, and settle accounts that had been outstanding for 15 years. As Cole chambered around into the Winchester, he thought about Emma's silver locket and Mary's herb garden, about Thomas's desperate love for his family and Morrison's attempt at redemption. Some debts could only be paid in blood, and some truths could only emerge from the ashes of the lies that had buried them. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Cole Barlow was ready to finish what Thomas Hendricks had started. The confession letter that Cole discovered tucked inside Emma's cradle during the final moments of the gunfight changed everything. As bullets splintered the wooden walls around him and the Western mining men closed in on the mine office, Cole's desperate search for additional ammunition had led him to tear apart the baby's carefully preserved sleeping place, and there, wrapped in oiled cloth beneath the cradle's false bottom, lay Thomas Hendricks's final testimony. Written in a shaking hand as the mine collapsed around his family, Thomas's confession revealed the complete truth about the conspiracy that had destroyed them. They offered me $10,000 for my claim. When I refused, they said they'd take it anyway and make it look legal. Morrison showed me the forged papers with my signature already on them. They never intended to let us leave this mountain alive. Mary and Emma are trapped below. I can hear them calling to me, but the eastern passage is blocked. If anyone finds this, know that we died fighting for what was right. The real evidence is hidden where only an honest man would think to look, in the place where love matters more than money. Cole's hands trembled as he read those final words, while rifle fire echoed through the abandoned camp. Thomas hadn't just been documenting the conspiracy, he'd been leaving clues for whoever would eventually discover the truth. The place where love matters more than money wasn't the stone vault filled with legal documents and ore samples. It was here, in the cradle where Thomas and Mary had placed their hopes for Emma's future, where a father's love had preserved the one piece of evidence that could bring down the entire criminal enterprise. The confession named names, revealed bank accounts, and detailed the systematic murder of at least 12 mining families throughout the territory. Thomas had been more than just a victim, he'd been an investigator, had spent his final weeks gathering evidence about a conspiracy that reached from local mining offices to the territorial legislature to corporate boardrooms in San Francisco and New York. Barlow, the grey-haired leader, shouted from somewhere near the assay office, "We're coming in! Last chance to surrender!" Cole folded Thomas's confession carefully and tucked it inside his shirt next to Morrison's documents, then peered through a crack in the mine office wall to assess the tactical situation. 3 men were approaching the building from different angles, while the others maintained overwatch positions on the surrounding ridges. They moved with professional coordination, but they'd made one critical mistake they didn't know about the hidden chamber beneath the floor. Cole dropped through the trapdoor into Thomas's sanctuary just as the first gunman kicked open the office door. The chamber's stone walls muffled the sound of boots crossing the wooden floor above, and Cole could hear the men searching through the building's sparse contents while cursing their quarry's apparent disappearance. "He's not here," one of them called out. "Check the stable. Maybe he's hiding with his mule." "No," the leader's voice carried clearly through the floorboards. "He was here. Look at this fresh lamp oil, warm ashes in the stove. He's close, probably watching us right now from one of those mine tunnels." Cole waited until the footsteps moved away from the office, then emerged from the hidden chamber and slipped out through the building's rear window. The searchers had made another tactical error. They'd assumed he would retreat deeper into the mine system when cornered, leaving the camp's perimeter less heavily guarded than the tunnels leading into the mountain. Moving with the careful stealth he'd learned during 15 years of avoiding trouble, Cole circled around the camp's edge until he reached the livery stable where Smoke was being held. The mule's dark eyes showed recognition and relief when Cole appeared at the stable door, but the animal remained calm and quiet. 15 years of partnership had taught them both the value of silence when danger was near. "Easy, old friend," Cole whispered, checking to make sure the gunmen were still searching the mine entrance. "We're going to finish this, but I need you to trust me one more time." Cole led Smoke out of the stable and toward the ridge overlooking the camp, using the animal's bulk to shield his movement from the searchers below. The mule seemed to understand the gravity of their situation and moved with unusual silence across the rocky ground, placing each hoof with deliberate care. From his new position on the high ground, Cole could see the entire tactical situation spread out below him like a military map. The Western mining men were competent but predictable, following patterns that suggested they'd never faced an opponent who understood both the terrain and the deeper stakes of their confrontation. Cole chambered around in the Winchester and sighted carefully on the leader, who was directing the search from near the mine entrance. Thomas Hendricks's confession lay against his chest like a talisman, and Emma's locket rested in his pocket beside Sarah's wedding ring, physical connections to the people who'd suffered and died so that powerful men could grow wealthier. The time for hiding was over. The final confrontation would be settled here, in the place where love had made its last stand against greed 15 years ago. Emma's silver rattle caught the morning light as Cole placed it gently on the small wooden cross he'd carved to mark the Hendricks family grave. The delicate toy that had once brought joy to a baby's curious hands now served a different purpose, a symbol of innocence preserved and memory honored, proof that love could endure even when the lovers themselves had been stolen by greed and violence. 3 months had passed since the gunfight at Sagebrush Hollow ended, with federal marshals arriving to find Cole standing over the bodies of 6 men who'd chosen to shoot rather than surrender. The evidence Cole had preserved from Thomas's vault had triggered the largest corruption investigation in territorial history, sending shockwaves from Carson City to Washington, D.C. as prosecutors unraveled a conspiracy that had claimed dozens of lives and stolen millions of dollars in mineral wealth. Western Mining Consolidated had dissolved overnight when its ownership structure was exposed, a web of shell companies and fraudulent partnerships that led directly to boardrooms in San Francisco where respectable businessmen had grown, wealthy on blood money. The railroad interests that had originally commissioned the murders were facing federal racketeering charges, and territorial officials who'd taken bribes to ignore mining claim irregularities were either in prison or fleeing toward Mexico with whatever assets they could liquidate quickly. Cole knelt beside the grave he'd dug in the meadow above Sagebrush Hollow, where wildflowers grew in the same colors as the pressed blooms Mary had preserved in her recipe box. The wooden marker bore a simple inscription carved with the careful attention Thomas would have. Thomas. Mary and Emma Rose Hendricks' beloved family, faithful hearts. Justice finally served. The territorial governor had offered Cole a substantial reward for his role in exposing the conspiracy, enough money to buy a ranch, to start over in comfort, to live the kind of secure life that most men his age could only dream about. But Cole had declined the reward and requested something different. Official custody of the Sagebrush Hollow site as a historical preserve, with legal authority to maintain the camp and tell its story to future generations. The request had puzzled government officials who couldn't understand why a man would choose responsibility over wealth, but Cole's reasoning was simple. The Hendricks family deserved better than to be forgotten footnotes in legal proceedings that would fade from public memory within a few years. Their story needed a guardian, someone who understood the weight of interrupted dreams and the persistence required to see justice through to completion. Cole had spent the autumn months restoring the camp buildings and creating a modest museum in what had once been the assay office. Visitors came regularly, now historians researching territorial politics, families tracing genealogies interrupted by violence, and occasionally elderly people who remembered relatives who disappeared in the mining districts during the 1,880 seconds and had never known what happened to them. Mary's herb garden flourished under Cole's careful attention, the mint patch spreading to claim new territory each season, while sage and thyme provided fragrant reminders that domestic love could take root even in harsh country. Cole had added vegetables and flowers that Mary would have appreciated, creating a living memorial to a woman who'd believed in making beauty wherever life led her. Smoke grazed contentedly in the meadow where the family lay buried, the old mule's grey coat thick with winter growth as December approached. The animals seemed to understand that their wandering days were finished, that they'd finally found the place where both of them belonged. Cole often caught the mule standing near the grave marker, ears pricked forward as if listening to voices only he could hear. The most unexpected discovery had come during Cole's restoration of the mine office, when he'd found Sarah's wedding ring sitting on the windowsill where he could have sworn he'd never left it. The gold band gleamed in the afternoon light, no longer worn smooth by anxious handling, but somehow renewed, ready for a different purpose than carrying grief from place to place. Cole had taken the ring to Carson City and commissioned a jeweler to create something Sarah would have appreciated, a pendant that combined her ring with Emma's locket, creating a single piece that honored both the love he'd shared and the family he'd helped find justice. He wore it now on a chain beneath his shirt, a reminder that some connections transcend death, and that keeping faith with the departed sometimes required more courage than letting them go. Winter was coming to the high desert, but Cole felt ready for the cold months ahead. He'd laid in supplies for himself and Smoke, had stocked the museum with enough firewood to keep visitors warm, and had prepared educational materials that would help people understand the true cost of corruption and the importance of standing up to powerful interests that believe themselves above the law. The confession letter that had exposed the conspiracy was now part of the territorial archives, but Cole kept Morrison's compass on display in the museum as a reminder that redemption was always possible, even for those who'd lost their way in service to the wrong causes. The instrument still pointed toward the sealed vault in the eastern passage, where Thomas's evidence remained preserved for any future investigators who might need proof of how far some men would go to protect their secrets. As evening approached, and Cole prepared to return to his quarters in the restored mine office, he paused at the family grave one final time. The silver rattle gleamed on the wooden cross, catching the last rays of sunlight like a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed determined to reward the wrong people for the wrong reasons. "Your story's being told now," Cole said quietly to the three souls who rested in the meadow above Sagebrush Hollow. "People are learning what you sacrificed, what you stood for, why you mattered. Emma's future turned out different than you planned, but it's still a future worth having." The wind carried the scent of Mary's herbs and the sound of Smoke's contented breathing, and for the first time in 28 years, Cole Barlow was exactly where he belonged.